The honourable member for Saanich, Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise today in this House to discuss Bill C-2. I want to start by stating my premise up front and clearly, and then speak to it throughout the 10 minutes I have. And my premise is this: fairness for the middle class and societal inequality cannot stand together. So I repeat, fairness for the middle class and societal inequality cannot stand together. We cannot, as a society, and nor can this government, decide that the middle class is the be-all and end-all of tax policy. And I will say this bill misses the mark on delivering for the middle class. But you cannot say that fairness for the middle class is the be-all and end-all for society, because as long as inequality and poverty persists, every part of society is disadvantaged. Every part of society is disadvantaged by the continuation of poverty. So recently, within the last half hour, I heard a Conservative member say the people who need the tax breaks the most, the people who need the help the most, are the middle class. No, Mr. Speaker, the people who need the help the most are the homeless, the people who need the help the most are the unemployed, the people who need the help the most are the poor. Now, in terms of inequality, where does Canada's society stand today? Right? By any measure, we are a fairer and more equitable society than the United States. But in a very real way, we are not as fair or as equitable as we used to be. I was staggered while doing research during the election campaign. I was digging all the time for stats and arguments for the few leaders' debates in which I was included. But it was in doing that research that I came across this stunning statistic. The 86 wealthiest families in Canada have more combined wealth than the 11.4 million Canadians at the bottom of the income brackets. 86 individual Canadian families have more wealth than 11.4 million Canadians at the bottom. Now, is this a problem? I submit to you it's a serious problem, and it's a problem that Bill C-2 will not address. And I don't imagine that anyone thought Bill C-2 would address it. So I will say, in fairness to the new government, and I'll come back to this, I hope that more is planned if they're serious about addressing income inequality. But let's just look at this at a higher plane of analysis, which is the mania for neoliberalism, for the policies of Milton Friedman, for the Thatcher-Reagan era, which launched policies in which no politician would say anything other than, we need smaller government, we need tax cuts, we need deregulation, we need trade liberalization, as though that mantra would deliver great blessings to a society overall. One of the economists who I think has skewered this most effectively with detailed empirical research, which does not brook a different opinion, because this economist comes fully loaded with the facts. And that's Nobel Prize-winning economist, currently a professor at Columbia University in New York, Joseph Stiglitz. And Stiglitz amassed all the information any parliament would need to decide that inequality is unacceptable for a society that wants to succeed at anything. Joseph Stiglitz's book, The Price of Inequality, is something that I hope every member of Parliament will read. And Stiglitz concludes that, quote, inequality leads to lower growth and less efficiency. Lack of opportunity means that its most valuable asset, any society's most valuable assets, its people. That asset is not being fully used. Now, there are a lot of things one can say about the era of Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberalism, and the kinds of trickle-down policies that were supposed to deliver benefits for all. But Joseph Stiglitz has pronounced, and I think it's time that we all learned how to say it, the neoliberalism experiment in tax cuts to deliver wealth has been tried and is a monumental failure. Growth is stagnant. The economy is suffering, not just in Canada, but everywhere. Canada particularly more than some of our OECD colleagues. We've had stagnant growth for a while now. We're not seeing investment, and I want to touch on what our corporate sector has been doing or not doing. Trickle-down economics is a joke. The great Canadian economist, the late John Kenneth Galbraith, used to explain trickle-down economics as this. If you feed a horse enough oats, the sparrows will eventually find a meal in the manure. That's trickle-down economics. Or as Gus Speth, who used to be head of the United Nations Development Program, once said, when they talk about trade liberalization, that a rising tide lifts all boats, we can now fairly say that a rising tide will lift all yachts, not all boats. We have a real challenge in our society, and boy, do we have a really good opportunity right now. I'd urge the new government to actually embrace the idea of tackling inequality in our society. We have seen a foundational shift in our tax system in the last 10 years. Let me just give you this statistic. I'm indebted to a great Canadian economist who I wish hadn't just moved to Australia, Jim Stanford, for having identified this, that over the 10 years of the previous government, the federal government revenue share of GDP, federal revenues as a share of GDP, fell from 16% in 2006 to 14.3% last year. Now, that may be celebrated by some, but tax cuts overall end up with shrinking revenue to do the things that society needs, like make sure our healthcare system works, deliver child care for all, make sure that we don't have people living in poverty who can't get adequate housing. Because again, and I repeat, the empirical evidence is clear, that disadvantages all of society, not just the poor. So if we're going to see a rise in revenue, that means politicians are going to have to get used to saying some words that have been drilled out of our lexicon since the Thatcher-Reagan era began, and that is to begin to say, where are we going to find the taxes to increase government revenue? Now, it's clear that this tax cut moderately readjusts a tax bracket, and our highest income earners, the top 20%, basically see $3 billion removed from the very highest taxpayers. So the very next highest taxpayers get a slight benefit. It's not bad in itself, but it is not on its own tax relief for the middle class, nor does it strike any significant blow against income inequality. So it's a small step, but tepid. And what it fails to do is really address the needs of the middle class, nor does it address the needs of the poor, nor does it really deal with the complicated tax code we have. I'd like to propose to the Minister of Finance that we need root and branch tax reform. We need to step back from all the fashionable pandering to individual sectors of a voting electorate, the boutique tax cuts of the previous 10 years. We need to review all of the complications that work against a tax code that, frankly, that fiscal conservatives say they want, that people in Canadians for Tax Fairness absolutely argue we need. We need to simplify our tax code by taking out the special rewards. If you happen to have a kid who's already in hockey, you can get a prize for that. If you're already taking the bus, you can get a prize for that. That's not good tax policy. We also need to look for where we should be increasing taxes. And I would suggest we need to look no farther than what happened to the tax code for the corporate tax rate in the previous 10 years. Now, it used to be 28% in the year 2000. By 2006, when the previous administration took over, it had dropped from 28% to 20%. It now stands at 15%. You might be interested to know, in comparison, the U.S. corporate income tax rate stands at 35%. Other than Ireland, which is at 12%, Canada has the lowest tax rate in the industrialized world, but certainly right now we stand with the lowest tax rate in the G7. And I would just, in the few seconds I have left, Mr. Speaker, draw members' attention to the fact that Canada's corporate tax cut has resulted in about $700 billion to date, being considered, as former Governor of the Bank of Canada described it, dead money. $700 billion sloshing around as available cash, not being reinvested in our economy where we need it. We may need to look at other tax measures. Down the road, we may need to look at the GST. The Green Party's not advocating raising that tax. We're talking about increasing the corporate tax rate. We believe it should be set where it was in 2008. We really need to look at a guaranteed livable income, because the bottom line is Canada's society are middle class. All of Canada's society will not experience well-being and prosperity as long as poverty persists.